You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things scientifically related to vertebrate pest management. All right. Hey, glad to have you on board. Hope your week went well. And yes, I am still trying to bang out some podcasts before my my departure for a little while. So I'm trying to get ahead of that before I go off and do some other things. And so anyways, we're hoping that you're glad that you're here, and we hope you enjoy the show, and also definitely check out the other videos. And so if you have questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions for new shows, perhaps there's a topic that's just sort of bothering you, would love to hear from you. I'm always looking for ideas that would be useful for the vertebrate pest community. And if you're a non-professional, we're glad to have you on board. But just a warning, we are very technical here in this particular project. So we do talk about trapping methods and things like that. We try to do something unusual. There's a lot of people out there doing vertebrate pest control videos that are about how-tos, and those are important, but that we try to go beyond that into information that can't be gleaned simply by experience. And so sometimes you need to have the researchers, and so we're trying to bridge that gap between the researcher area and the practical application of that information so that you can put this information for work in your business, or perhaps for the situation that you're resolving. And we're trying to forward things on that. So if you have a suggestion for a show, we'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have a product or service that you would like to get out to the vertebrate pest community, we'd love to hear from you as well. We're trying to get information out, and we hope to be a positive influence in that direction. So, all right, well, enough about that. So just wanted to highlight the personal consultation. I had the privilege of working with a company recently on a particular topic, and I think I was able to really provide some context. They had an interesting idea that they wanted to develop for the wildlife control field. Didn't want to discourage that very much because I thought it was kind of cool, but I wanted to just caution them about the size of the market that they were going for, right? And so that they needed to really think about a few things before they put a whole lot of time and energy into it. And so, and they seem to have appreciated. So it was just a quick $75. We talked about an hour, and it really gave them a lot of information in a hurry that would save them probably hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in time and expenditure down the road. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely reach out and contact me. We'd love to talk to you about how we can help you. All right. Well, what's this week's presentation? Well, I was doing some work again a while back. We had people asking about how far can you relocate raccoons to kind of prevent them from coming back, right? And so this was an article that I came across and thought I would highlight some of the information, because one of the things about scientific research is no two pieces of information and research are identical. So they can be similar, but often there's always other unknown factors that influence the results. And it's hard to make, so that there are laws in nature, but they get broken or twisted every now and again, right? And certainly animals aren't abiding by laws per se, right? Raccoons are individuals, and they have some decision-making capability, and also the environment can be different. So we're learning new things all the time. And so this is a publication on relocation and translocation of wildlife. Now, if you're not familiar with those terms, relocation is the movement of an animal and releasing it within its home range. Translocation is the capture of an animal and the moving it and releasing it to another location outside of its home range. So, in other words, if you have a squirrel in your basement and someone traps it and releases it in the backyard, that's a relocation, because the squirrel is still in its home range area. It's familiar with your backyard, right? Otherwise, why would it be inside your basement? Now, if you did the same squirrel and traveled 5 miles away and released it, now that squirrel has been released outside of its home range. and that's a translocation. Much more stressful. There's a lot more humane issues involved with that, as well as some ecological, environmental issues related to that as well, plus legal issues, right? And so that would depend on the laws and regulations in your particular area. But nevertheless, so these are important topics, but there are states that do permit the translocation of wildlife, and raccoons are one of them. Other states forbid it completely. So, you have to know your own laws in your state. But this is basically, we're summarizing an article, and let's take a look at that particular article title. It's called Spatial Ecology of Translocated Raccoons. So spatial ecology is sort of a term about how the animal is interacting with the environment that it's put into. And so we'll unpack that a little bit more, because they're not just simply moving the animal from one place to another, they're moving it to a specific type of habitat. So they're taking it from one habitat and then they're moving it either to a similar habitat that the animal's familiar with. It's a different location, but it's not the same. It's the same habitat. It's sort of like if you're a city boy and you live in New York City, but now you're being moved from New York City to, let's say, Los Angeles, okay? So it's a different city, but it's still a city, right? They're not moving you to, Lewistown, Montana, for example, okay? Now, they also did the same type of work where they took, if someone moved you to a different location, like, for example, you're a city boy and they take you from New York City and drop you in Yellowstone National Park, right? That's not an urban area. So you can see then how does the animal react to that sort of thing. So that's what this particular study is about. The authors of the study are Jacob E. Hill, James L. Helton, Richard B. Chipman, Amy T. Gilbert, James C. Beasley, Guha Daharmarajan, hope I pronounced that right, and Olin E. Rhodes. So let me repeat that for you again. It's Jacob E. Hill, James L. Helton, Richard B. Chipman, Amy T. Gilbert, James C. Beasley, Guha Dahamarajan, and Olin E. Rhodes. And they wrote the article, Spatial Ecology of Translocated Raccoons. That was published in the journal Scientific Reports 2023, so it's not that old. Volume 13, and then they don't use page numbers in this particular document, so it's just giving you a document number, and that's 10447. So 13:10447. And again, that's published in the journal Scientific Reports. So let's take a look at what they had to do. So the research was done in the state of South Carolina, giving you, for those of you who are listening outside the U.S., just kind of giving you an idea of where South Carolina is. It's just north of Georgia, so it's hot down there, and it's a coastal state on the eastern seaboard, just one state away from the state of Florida. So what they did was they trapped raccoons. Some raccoons were trapped in the bottomland hardwood site, and they called that a high-density resource location. What they mean by that is that raccoons that lived there had easy access to a variety of food sources and places to live. So they called it a high-density resource. And that's the bottomlands, right? So it's going to be wet, there's going to be water there, and it's going to be a hardwood forest type situation. They also trapped raccoons in what they called a low-density resource site, and those were the highland area, the upland pine sites. So there's a pine forest, not as many resources. The raccoon densities up there are obviously much lower because it's harder for them to eke out a living. So these are the two different sources of raccoons that they've captured. And these are within 50 or 60 miles of one another. I think they did all this in one or two counties, if memory serves, from this particular site. But nevertheless, they trapped raccoons in two different environmental locations, right? Think of it as a city boy with lots of resources, lots of grocery stores, versus a country boy where the supermarket is 30 miles away, right? And so upland pine site, low resource location, bottomland, swamps, hardwood forests, high density resource site. All right. And here's what they did. They captured 26 raccoons. All of them were collared, right? They're radio collaring them. They're trying to track their movements. And then they translocated those raccoons 10 to 12 and a half miles, give or take. So it's a pretty good distance, right? Not an extreme distance, but they moved them a pretty good distance. And they did this in the fall and winter of 2018, 2019. So they probably did it during that time, partly to make sure that they weren't doing this to young or maybe a female that would have been pregnant. So that's why they probably didn't do it during the spring. Plus, in terms of research time, it's a whole lot better to work in the wintertime down there than it would be during the summer, right? Summer's probably as hot as hell. All right, so what they have here, notice what we have, a little diagram. Not a diagram, a table. So they had bottom hardwood to upland, and then they had pre and post translocation phases, right? So they had 5 females, 4 males, and then they post relocation, they had 1 female, two males, and then the upland pineland to upland pineland, they had 1 male, they only had 1 male, and then they post translocation, they had 3 females, 1 male, 4 total. And you can see the rest of those numbers there. Now, if you're wondering why they don't add up to 26, well, because some of the animals lost their collars. Okay, so that was certainly a problem for some of them. But they originally started, I think they originally started with more than 26, but then they kind of came down to 26. But nevertheless, that's what they were using. And here were the options for the particular study. So a raccoon that was translocated and released. Option 1 for the raccoon, right? That they had to calculate what did the animal do. So option 1 was the raccoon remained near the site of release. Now, what did that mean in their terms of their research? For them, it was the raccoon stayed within 2.5 miles from the release location and at least stayed more than 8 miles from the capture site. That was called a remain at release site. And of the raccoons that they dealt with, 5 did that. So when they released it, the raccoon kind of stayed in the general area. Option 2, raccoons could move from the release site to a new home range. In other words, so outside of that particular release site, and that was they had to move farther than 2.5 miles from the release site and go at least greater than 8 miles from the capture site. And 10 of the raccoons did that. And then the third option was they had movement from release site back to the capture location. Now, they didn't have to go back to the exact location. They just had to be close. And that meant their final location was less than 2.5 miles from the release location, but more than 8 miles from the capture site. And I have that wrong. So the final location should be less than 2.5 miles from the capture location. So I've got to correct that. That was my mistake. My apologies. So 3 raccoons came back to the release site. 2 of them, it took 81 days, and the second one took 54 days. So it took a while for some of those raccoons to get back to their original capture site. That's amazing, right? So they've been moved 10 to 12.5 miles, and it took one of them 81 days to get back, and 54 days for another one to get back. But a total of 3 came back to the area what they would call their capture site. So we have 3 behavioral states. Pre-translocation, that's the control. This is an animal that's just they're sort of hanging out, and then they have when they release the animal, what does it do? It goes transient. That means it explores the area for an average of 36.5. You understand that when a raccoon has been released to a new area, it is very disruptive to them. Just as if I, we don't want to humanize the raccoons too much here, but if I took you and I'm like, I want to find out what he does, and so I'm just going to take this guy and I'm going to strap a parachute on him and fly over, let's say Yellowstone. I'm going to push him out of the airplane, pull the ripcord, and he wafts down and finds himself in Yellowstone National Park. Well, do you think you would be disoriented? Do you think you'd be trying to figure out how to find food and shelter and resources while avoiding some of the big apex predators we have down there? Yeah, you'd be pretty stressed. Well, the raccoon is no different, and they are going to this exploratory phase after release, and that can extend for as long, on average, for all the raccoons that they've watched, 36 and a half days. So over a month, this raccoon is just traveling all over the place. The third phase of the raccoon's behavior is when it finally calms down and establishes a new home range after it's been translocated. So for about a month, or maybe I should say 5 weeks, that raccoon's life has really been turned upside down. So that is just from the research that they were doing at this particular time and this particular site. So the notion that translocating an animal is somehow more humane, you may think it's more humane, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have consequences, right? And so that raccoon is really stressing out, to be sure. Now, what were the results? Here are the results of the translocation of the animals by gender and by their state. And by state, we're not referring to the political entity. We're referring to those behavioral states, how the raccoons were acting. So they have a data for the various raccoons and how they were acting together. And here we have the source habitat, bottomland hardwood, of which there were 5 captured. We have the upland raccoons, of which there were 6 captured. And if you look carefully at this chart, you'll see that the raccoons aren't really moving very much because they were captured and let go in the area that they're familiar with. Look what happens when the raccoons are captured and then translocated to a new area. Now we have movements of 12.3 kilometers, right? So a kilometer is just a little over half a mile. So they're moving some significant distances, as opposed to when they were in the control room, they're only moving a little over half a mile, right? Because capture itself is stressful, right? And look at the ones that are happening when they're moved in their transient phase. In the upland pine area, they're traveling over 15 kilometers. Why? Because they're probably searching for more resources in a resource-stressed area. So we're clearly learning from this that when you're translocating an animal, you do need to be thinking about how many resources are going to be available to the raccoon. See, this problem in America is we think that, the raccoon, there's this mountain and it's just empty of animals and it just needs more raccoons there. And I have raccoons and I want to get rid of my raccoons. So I'm going to release it in that mountain there because they need raccoons. They don't have any. That's just simply not true. So we have this mythology in America that there's just this sort of empty wild land that's just telling us to bring us your raccoons because we need raccoons. The raccoons you're not finding them there because the habitat is not as suitable for them as maybe your backyard is with a trash can. Animals are going to go where the resources are, right? And so you're going to have higher densities of animals where that are resource rich versus areas that are not resource rich. So this notion that we just need to move the animals from high density areas to low density areas doesn't work if the resources aren't there in the low density areas to make up for it. And the problem is, if the resources were there, they would likely have a high population of raccoons to begin with. The only thing that messes that up is areas that have heavy hunting or heavy trapping. Then you have an artificial reduction of population, and then maybe translocation to that location would work. So you can see they differentiate it by gender, and notice how the males were acting and the female. Notice the males are traveling significantly farther than the females. And part of that may be just to sort of establish dominance or to find females in the area that they may potentially mate with. But the numbers are significantly higher for the males than it is for the females. And that's basically some important points there. So how do we bottom line this for you? It's like, oh, Stephen, we have all this data. What do we do with it all? Okay, well, let me kind of bottom line it for you. Number one, translocated raccoons expanded their home range on average 13 times of what their resident home range was. So in other words, when the raccoon was taken from where they were living and then brought to a new area, and established a new home range. Remember, it's the third state, right? So the second state is the raccoon is struggling, trying to orient itself, and then it finally establishes a home range at state 3. That new state is 13 times larger than than the area that you originally took them from was. Now that's stress. And the likely reason is the raccoon's desperately looking for resources and trying to establish its food. Remember, when you move an animal to a new location and release it that's outside of its home range, it has to reorient itself. It has to avoid predators. It has to avoid what's called conspecifics, which means animals of the same species that are bigger than it, that it can get beat up on by, and then find those resources, right? So it's very, very stressful. It's got to find a place to live. So very, very stressful. So their new home range is 13 times the size of their previous home range. That's amazing. Okay. As I've already mentioned before, male raccoons had higher home ranges before translocation and during the transient phase of location. So they're moving dramatically. Okay, they'll likely for mating purposes, because again, this was done in the fall and winter. And winter time is, raccoons need to find out where the ladies are. Another point that you need to think about, and that is raccoons from low resource areas, in other words, the raccoons that were captured in the pinelands, the upland pines, traveled farther during the transient phase of translocation, even when they were released in high resource environments. So a raccoon that was moved from the upland pines to a new area that was the bottomlands still had a larger than usual home range, even though there are lots of resources around. And maybe that's because the raccoon's not as familiar with how to capture those resources. But it's like it said, I got to travel far to get food. And when it was an area with more food, it still traveled far. Just couldn't get out. It was the old habits maybe die hard. That's maybe the one possibility with raccoons. So you want to release an animal into a similar habitat that it's familiar with. That would be more ideal than releasing it into an environment that it's not familiar with. Okay, so this requires a lot more work on the part of a wildlife control operator or on part of a homeowner who's just trying to dump a raccoon somewhere. And I can guarantee you most people aren't going to do that because they don't care. All right, so I'll let you decide the morality of that. Notice that when animals are translocated and released, and here we're talking about raccoons, they moved a greater distance. Remember what I said earlier, 13 times they had new home range, 13 times the size of their previous home range. That expansion of home range poses risks if the raccoon that was relocated was sick. So if you have a sick raccoon, maybe it was in the prodromal stage and you weren't aware that it was sick, and you translocate it and dump it, and it actually is sick, understand it has a greater chance of spreading that disease to other animals. Is that humane? Right? Was that a responsible thing to do? Okay, I'll let you decide that for yourself as well. Second, note that movement of a translocated raccoon was extensive even when the raccoon was released into a high resource habitat. And again, it's like those old habits die hard, and also the animal is still trying to reorient itself to the new area. So it's basically traveling all the various streets of the new neighborhood because it's trying to figure out its new environment. Lastly, and this is something to keep in mind, you're going to need to move raccoons more than 8 miles. In fact, I would probably say it's more in the vicinity of 20 to 25 miles from a location to really minimize the risk of that raccoon coming back. And ideally, you'd want to move that raccoon over a significant environmental barrier, a river, perhaps a major highway, for example, a lake, something where it really makes it hard that it's something that's hard for that animal to overcome. So think 20 miles, 25 miles to get that raccoon to not come back. Because you can see here some of the raccoons, when they were released more than 8 miles away, or they were likely to come back. Actually, I think it's 20, I think they were released, let me get back to it here, 10 to 12 and a half miles. Some of them did return. So it's clearly not enough. Not a lot returned, but it's clearly not enough. So you'd probably want to hit it out to 20 miles. And as the crow flies, to get it over a major barrier. As you can tell, I'm not a big fan of translocation, but for those of you where it's legal, you need to be thinking about some of these things, and this will allow you to differentiate yourself from your competitors. Perhaps you have an area that you work, maybe you do a trap line in the wintertime and you really hammer the raccoons, that maybe that's a place where you could release the raccoons because it's a high resource environment and you're going to be moving a lot of raccoons in the fall. That may be something to think about. Now that would possibly work. Okay, but it's something, but if you're relocating animals, it makes people all warm and fuzzy inside, but it doesn't make it necessarily humane or environmentally responsible. Well, that's it for this week, and I hope that gives you a little bit more insight on the translocation of raccoons and how you as professionals should be thinking about what you're doing and what your company policies are. So I'm Stephen Van Tassel. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest control from a scientific and technical perspective. So love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you have thoughts, comments, yes, even criticisms, you can definitely reach me there. And of course, if you would have service needs for consultation or perhaps doing a personal training for your company, love to have you reach out and we can make those types of arrangements. And that's it. Until next time, take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.